They said Rowan Blackwood was the devil in human skin, a mountain cowboy who settled disputes with bullets and buried his secrets in the snow. So when Clara Hayes stood at the altar in a borrowed dress, the whole town of Pine Hollow came to witness what they believed was her funeral, not her wedding. Her father's gambling debt had sealed her fate. The vows were spoken, the ring was placed, and everyone waited to see if the feared mountain man would claim his prize or destroy her. Stay until the end to see how a forced marriage became something nobody expected. Hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The church bells rang like a death knell. Clara Hayes stood in the cramped back room of Pine Hollow's only church, staring at her reflection in a cracked mirror that had seen better brides and better days. The dress she wore wasn't hers. It belonged to Mrs. Garrett, the schoolteacher's wife, and it hung loose in the shoulders, tight in the waist, a borrowed thing for a borrowed life. The lace at the collar scratched her throat. The hem dragged on the floor. She looked like a child playing dress-up, except there was nothing playful about what was happening. Through the thin walls, she could hear the murmur of the crowd. Not guests. A crowd. Pine Hollow didn't usually fill the church on a Wednesday afternoon, but today was different. Today was spectacle. Today was the day Thomas Hayes's debts finally came due, and his daughter was the currency. Clara's hands trembled as she tried to pin a wilted rose to her bodice. The stem pricked her finger, drawing a small bead of blood that stained the white fabric. She watched it spread, a tiny bloom of red on borrowed white, and thought that it was fitting. Everything about this day was stained. "Clara." Her father's voice came from the doorway, rough and tired. Thomas Hayes looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 months. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his hands shaking worse than hers. "It's time." She didn't turn around. "I know. I'm sorry." His voice cracked. "God, Clara, I'm so sorry." Now she turned, and the look she gave him was not angry. Anger would have required energy she didn't have. It was simply empty. "Are you?" He flinched like she'd struck him. You never meant to lose the ranch at a card table in Copper Ridge. You never meant to borrow money from men who don't forgive debts. You never meant for Harlan Crow to show up at our door with papers that said he owned our land, our cattle, and me." She spoke quietly, each word deliberate. "But you did all those things anyway." Thomas's shoulders sagged. "I know what Crow would have done." Clara cut him off, her voice sharp now. "He made it very clear what kind of arrangement he wanted. A housekeeper, he called it. A companion." She spat the word like poison. "We both know what that meant." Harlan Crow was a land baron who'd built his empire on the broken backs of smaller ranchers. He was 63 years old, twice widowed, and known for his particular tastes. The women who worked in his house didn't stay long, and when they left, they didn't talk about what happened behind those walls. But their eyes said enough. Thomas's face crumpled. "So I found another way. Blackwood's debts were almost as bad as mine, and he needed a wife he could sell when he gets bored?" Clara's laugh was bitter. "Or just one who'll warm his bed until he drinks himself to death up on that mountain?" "No." Thomas shook his head, almost desperate. "No, Clara, listen. Blackwood he's not what people say. I've known men like Crow. I've seen what they do. Blackwood is different." "Different how? Because he shoots men in the open instead of in the dark? Because he lives like an animal in the wilderness instead of in a big house?" Clara turned back to the mirror, unable to look at her father anymore. "I'm being traded from one devil to another. The only difference is that everyone's afraid of this one." The truth was that nobody in Pine Hollow really knew Rowan Blackwood. He was a ghost, a rumor, a shadow that appeared in town twice a year to sell furs and buy supplies before disappearing back into the mountains. Stories followed him like smoke. Stories of men who'd gone up that mountain looking for him and never come back down. Stories of gunfights and knife fights, and a cabin built on land soaked in blood. Some said he'd killed a man in Texas and fled north. Others said he'd been a soldier who'd lost his mind in the war. A few whispered that he'd murdered his own brother over a woman and now lived alone because he couldn't be trusted around people. The only thing everyone agreed on was that Rowan Blackwood was dangerous, and smart people stayed away. "He agreed to clear the debt," Thomas said quietly. "All of it. Crow's loan, the bank, everything. And he signed papers that say you can keep your name, keep whatever you bring with you, keep my freedom? Clara laughed again, hollow. Except for the part where I have to go live in his cabin and be his wife. It's not, Thomas started, then stopped. What could he say? It was exactly that. Through the wall, the murmur of the crowd grew louder, impatient, eager. Clara took a breath and smoothed down the dress that didn't fit, in preparation for a life that wouldn't either. We should go. They're waiting to see the show. Her father reached for her hand, but she pulled away. She'd cried all her tears 3 nights ago when he'd told her what he'd done. There was nothing left now but the walk down the aisle and the words that would seal her fate. The door to the sanctuary opened, and the faces turned toward her like flowers toward the sun. Except there was no warmth in their gazes, only curiosity and pity and the dark satisfaction of watching someone else's tragedy unfold. Clara recognized most of them. Mrs. Patterson from the general store, who'd once told Clara she had a bright future. Mr. Chen, who ran the boarding house and had always been kind. The Garrett family in the 3rd row, their children wide-eyed and solemn. Sarah Dennison, who'd been Clara's friend before social standing made friendship complicated, now whispering behind her hand to her mother. They'd all come to witness, to judge, to confirm what they already believed, that Thomas Hayes was a fool, that his daughter was paying the price, and that Rowan Blackwood was exactly the monster everyone said he was. At the front of the church, beside Reverend Morris's nervous, sweating form, stood the groom. Clara's breath caught despite herself. She'd expected someone older, hardened, perhaps scarred, or twisted by the violent life everyone claimed he'd lived. Instead, Rowan Blackwood stood tall and still, maybe 30 years old, with broad shoulders under a dark coat that looked new, probably bought just for this. His hair was black, longer than fashionable, brushing his collar. His face was angular, clean-shaven, handsome in a way that seemed almost wrong given everything she'd heard about him. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They were gray, like storm clouds over the mountains, and when they met hers across the church, there was no cruelty in them, no triumph, no possession. There was only something that looked almost like regret. The walk down the aisle felt eternal. Each step echoed in the silent church. Clara kept her chin up, her eyes forward, refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing her break. Beside her, her father's breathing was ragged, his hand trembling under her arm. When they reached the altar, Thomas stepped back, leaving Clara alone with the man who'd bought her. Up close, Rowan Blackwood was even more imposing. He stood at least 6 inches taller than her, his presence solid and unmovable. But when he offered his hand, his touch was careful, almost gentle, and his voice was low enough that only she could hear. I'm sorry it's come to this. Clara stared at him, thrown off balance. Of all the things she'd expected him to say, an apology wasn't one of them. Reverend Morris cleared his throat, clearly eager to get this over with. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. The words washed over Clara like water over stone. She heard them without processing them, aware only of the weight of every eye in the church, the too-tight dress, the man beside her who smelled like pine and leather and wood smoke. Not like whiskey. Not like Harlan Crow's expensive cigars and expensive cologne that couldn't quite cover the scent of rot underneath. Do you, Rowan Blackwood, take this woman? I do. His voice was steady, certain, like he was making a promise instead of claiming property. And do you, Clara Hayes, take this man? The church held its breath. This was the moment they'd all come for, to see if she'd refuse, if she'd run, if she'd make this even more of a spectacle than it already was. Clara looked at Rowan Blackwood, at this stranger who was about to become her husband, at the only thing standing between her and Harlan Crow's particular kind of hell. She thought about her mother, dead these 8 years, who'd always said that sometimes survival was the only victory you could manage. I do. The words tasted like ash. Reverend Morris, sweating even more now, rushed through the rest. By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may... He didn't finish the sentence. The tradition was to tell the groom to kiss his bride, but one look at Rowan Blackwood's face made it clear that wasn't going to happen. Instead, Rowan turned to Clara and offered his arm. Mrs. Blackwood. The name felt foreign, wrong, like a coat that didn't fit. But Clara took his arm because there was nothing else to do, and together they walked back down the aisle through a church full of whispers and stares. Outside, the February cold hit like a slap. Snow covered the ground in uneven patches, and the mountains loomed in the distance, blue-gray against a white sky. Somewhere up there was the cabin that would be her prison. A wagon waited at the edge of the churchyard, Rowan's, she assumed. It was sturdy but plain, loaded with supplies that suggested a long journey. 2 horses were hitched to it, both dark and well-muscled. Thomas emerged from the church, carrying the single trunk that held everything Clara owned. His face was wet with tears he hadn't bothered to hide. "Clara, Goodbye, Father." She kept her voice neutral, empty. She couldn't afford emotion right now. Emotion would break her, and she needed to stay intact. Rowan took the trunk and loaded it into the wagon with an ease that spoke of hard-earned strength. Then he turned to Thomas and held out a leather portfolio. "The papers. Everything's cleared. The ranch is yours free and clear, the bank debt's paid, and Crow's loan is settled. It's all documented and filed with the territorial office in Cheyenne." Thomas took the portfolio with shaking hands. "Blackwood, thank you. I know this isn't—" "Don't." Rowan's voice wasn't unkind, but it was firm. "Don't thank me for this. Just take care of your land and don't gamble it away again." He turned to Clara then, and for a moment she thought he might try to help her into the wagon. Instead, he simply gestured to the seat. "It's a 3-hour ride to the cabin. There are blankets in the back if you get cold." Clara climbed up herself, grateful that he hadn't touched her, hadn't made a show of playing the solicitous husband for the watching crowd. She settled onto the hard wooden seat and pulled her shawl tighter against the cold. Rowan climbed up beside her and took the reins. The crowd from the church had spilled out into the yard now, watching, always watching. Clara saw Sarah Dennison whispering to her mother, saw Mrs. Patterson shaking her head, saw Mr. Chen's face creased with concern. And at the edge of the crowd, half hidden behind the church wall, she saw him. Harlan Crow. He was a tall man, well-dressed, his silver hair perfectly groomed under an expensive hat. His face was handsome in the way that a snake is handsome, beautiful and deadly. When his eyes met Clara's, he smiled. It was a smile that said, "This isn't over." A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the February cold. Rowan must have seen him too because his jaw tightened and his hand moved subtly toward his coat, toward what Clara assumed was a gun hidden there. But he didn't draw it. Instead, he simply clicked his tongue and the horses started forward, pulling the wagon out of the churchyard and onto the rutted mountain road. Pine Hollow fell away behind them. Clara didn't look back. The road climbed steadily upward, leaving the town and its judgment behind. The landscape changed as they rose. Fewer farms, more forest, the air growing thinner and colder. Snow lay deeper here, untouched by wagon wheels or footprints. It was beautiful in a desolate way, all white silence and dark trees. They rode in silence for the first hour. Clara had nothing to say, and Rowan seemed content not to force conversation. He drove with casual competence, guiding the horses around rough patches and fallen branches with barely a thought. Clara studied him from the corner of her eye. Now that they were away from the crowd, his shoulders had lost some of their tension, but his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the tree line, the road ahead, the mountains above, like he was expecting trouble, or like trouble was always expecting him. "There's water in the canteen behind you," Rowan said suddenly, his first word since they'd left town. "And some bread and cheese if you're hungry." "I'm not." Clara's stomach was a tight knot. The thought of food made her nauseous. He nodded once and fell silent again. Another hour passed. The road grew steeper, narrower. They passed a burned-out cabin, its chimney standing like a grave marker among the ruins. "What happened there?" Clara asked, before she could stop herself. Rowan's expression darkened. "Claim jumpers, 3 winters back. Family name Morrison. They didn't survive." "Did you—" She stopped, unsure if she wanted to know the answer. "Did I kill them?" Rowan's voice was flat. "No. Winter did. I found them in the spring." Clara wasn't sure if she believed him, but she let it drop. The sun was starting to sink toward the western peaks when the cabin finally came into view. It sat in a small clearing backed against a cliff face with a stream running nearby. It was larger than Clara had expected. Not just one room, but several. with a covered porch and a sturdy chimney. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line. "Someone's here," Clara said, her voice tight. "Just Marcus. He's been watching the place while I was gone." Rowan pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin. "He'll leave tonight." Before Clara could respond, the door opened and a man stepped out. He was older than Rowan, maybe 40, with gray in his beard and a limp in his left leg. He looked from Rowan to Clara, and something shifted in his expression, surprise, maybe, or concern. "So you went through with it," Marcus said. "I did." Rowan climbed down from the wagon and started unloading Clara's trunk. Marcus approached the wagon, his eyes on Clara. "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Name's Marcus Webb. I'm a friend of Rowan's, nothing more. I'll be leaving you two to settle in." Clara nodded, unsure what to say. Marcus turned to Rowan and lowered his voice, but Clara heard him anyway. "Crow know?" "He was at the church." Rowan's hands tightened on the trunk. "He knows?" "Then you'd better watch your back, brother. He's not the type to let something like this go." "I know." Rowan hauled the trunk toward the cabin. "That's why I did it." Marcus sighed, then looked up at Clara again. "Ma'am, I don't know what you've heard about this man, but most of it's lies. He's rough, and he's got a past, but he's not what Pine Hollow says he is. Remember that." With that cryptic statement, Marcus gathered his things, a bedroll, a rifle, a saddlebag, and swung onto a horse that had been waiting by the side of the cabin. He tipped his hat to Clara one more time, nodded to Rowan, and rode off into the gathering dusk. And then they were alone. Rowan stood on the porch, Clara's trunk at his feet, looking at her still sitting in the wagon. The light was fading fast, turning the clearing into shades of gray and blue. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called. "You should come inside," Rowan said finally. "It gets cold quick up here once the sun's down." Clara climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the long ride. She walked toward the cabin like she was walking toward her execution, each step an effort of will. The inside of the cabin was not what she'd expected. It was clean, for one thing. The floor was swept, the windows were intact, and the furniture, while simple, was well made and cared for. A fire burned in a large stone fireplace, filling the room with warmth and the scent of burning pine. There was a table, chairs, a cabinet for dishes, shelves lined with books, actual books, more than Clara had expected a mountain hermit to own. And there was one bed. Clara's heart sank as she stared at it. It was large, covered with what looked like a bear fur pushed against the far wall. One bed in a one-room cabin. She'd known this was coming, but knowing it and facing it were different things. Rowan followed her gaze. "That's yours." She turned to him, confused. "What?" "The bed. It's yours." He set her trunk down beside it. "I'll sleep there." He pointed to a bedroll already laid out by the fireplace. "There's a lock on the door, and you can have the only key. I won't come in unless you invite me. I won't touch you unless you ask me to. And I sure as hell won't force anything on you, ever." Clara stared at him, trying to understand. "But you married me. You paid for—" "I paid to keep you out of Harlan Crow's hands," Rowan interrupted, his voice hard. "Not to make you a prisoner in mine." "I don't understand." Clara's voice shook. "Everyone says you're dangerous, a killer, a madman who lives in the mountains because he can't be trusted around civilized folk." Rowan's smile was bitter. "Yeah, they say a lot of things. Some of them are even true. But I've never hurt a woman, and I'm not about to start with the one I just vowed to protect." He crossed to the far side of the room and opened a door Clara hadn't noticed. "There's another room back here. Smaller, but it's got a cot. I'll sleep there. The main room's yours. The bed, the fire, all of it. I'll knock before I come through." Clara's mind was reeling. This didn't make sense. Men didn't pay a small fortune for a wife and then give her the bed and sleep on a cot in another room. They didn't offer locks and keys and boundaries. They didn't— Why? The word came out broken. "Why would you do all this if you didn't want—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Rowan was quiet for a long moment, his back to her, his shoulders tense. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. 3 months ago, Harlan Crow came to me with a proposition. He said he'd heard I was having trouble with claim jumpers, that he could make that trouble go away if I'd help him with something. I told him I wasn't interested. He told me what that something was. He turned to face her then, and in the firelight, his eyes looked haunted. He told me about Thomas Hayes and the debts. He told me he'd arranged to take those debts in exchange for certain considerations. He wanted me to help him transport you to his house. Make sure you didn't run. Keep your father from changing his mind. He offered me money, land, protection. All I had to do was help him acquire you. Clara's blood ran cold. And I told him to go to hell. Rowan's jaw clenched. Then I rode down to town and found your father. I told him I'd clear his debts and marry you myself, all legal and proper, with papers that would keep Crow from having any claim. Your father didn't want to trade one bad situation for another, but I convinced him that at least with me you'd have a choice. Eventually. A choice, Clara echoed hollowly. Yeah. Rowan picked up a poker and stirred the fire, not looking at her. Once Crow realizes he can't get to you through legal means, he'll move on. Find some other poor soul to torment. Give it a year, maybe 2. Then if you want to leave, I'll give you the money to start over somewhere else. Somewhere far from here. Far from him, far from me. You can get a divorce, change your name, build whatever life you want, free and clear. Clara sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. You married me to save me from Crow, and you're planning to let me go. Yes. Then why marry me at all? Why not just pay the debts and... Because Crow doesn't respect money. He respects ownership. Rowan's voice was hard. A debt paid is just an inconvenience. But a legal marriage, filed and registered, with a husband who's made it clear he'll kill anyone who touches his wife? That's a line even Crow thinks twice about crossing. You'd kill for me. It wasn't a question. I'd kill to keep you out of his hands. Rowan met her eyes directly. There's a difference. Clara wanted to argue with that, to find the flaw in his logic, to understand why a complete stranger would upend his life to save hers. But she was too tired, too overwhelmed, too wrung out from a day that had started with her being sold and ended with this, whatever this was. There's a wash basin in the corner, Rowan said, his voice gentler now, and fresh water in the pitcher. I'll bring in more wood for the fire, then I'll leave you alone for the night. If you need anything, just knock on that door. I'm a light sleeper. He started for the cabin door, but Clara's voice stopped him. Rowan? He turned back, waiting. Thank you. The words felt inadequate, too small for what he'd done, but they were all she had. Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or something softer. Get some rest, Clara. Tomorrow we'll figure out how this is going to work. Then he was gone, and Clara was alone in a mountain cabin that was supposed to be her prison, but felt more like a sanctuary. She sat on the edge of the bed, her bed, and finally let herself cry. But this time, the tears weren't just for what she'd lost. They were for what she might, impossibly, have found. Outside, the mountain night settled in around the cabin. The fire crackled. The wind whispered through the pines. And somewhere in the darkness, Clara could have sworn she heard the howl of a wolf, distant, wild, and free. The first light of morning came cold and gray through the cabin windows, turning the frost on the glass into delicate patterns that looked like lace. Clara woke slowly, disoriented by the unfamiliar weight of the bear fur covering her, the smell of wood smoke and pine that filled the air, the absolute silence that pressed against the walls like something alive. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back, the wedding, the wagon ride, the cabin, Rowan's unexpected offer of freedom that felt more confusing than any claim of ownership would have been. She sat up, still wearing the borrowed wedding dress because she'd been too exhausted to change, and looked around the room that was supposedly hers. Someone had been in during the night, the fire had been built up, fresh wood stacked beside the hearth, and a basin of water sat steaming gently on the table. But the door to the back room was closed, and she hadn't heard a sound. Clara washed her face in the warm water, grateful for the simple luxury of it, then dug through her trunk for something more practical than the wedding dress. She pulled out a wool dress in dark blue, one she'd made herself 2 years ago, and changed quickly in the cold morning air. When she finally emerged from behind the privacy screen in the corner, she found Rowan sitting at the table, 3 plates laid out in front of him. He looked up when he heard her, his gray eyes unreadable in the early light. "Morning." "Good morning." Clara's voice came out hoarse, uncertain. She'd spent half the night awake, trying to make sense of the man who'd married her to protect her, and she still hadn't found any answers that made sense. "Coffee's hot. Breakfast is ready whenever you are." Rowan gestured to the stove where a pot sat warming. "We don't have much in the way of fancy food up here, but there's eggs, bacon, and bread I baked yesterday." Clara blinked. "You bake bread?" "Can't live on meat and coffee alone. Tried it once. Nearly died." There was the faintest hint of humor in his voice, so subtle she almost missed it. She poured herself coffee from the pot, strong and black, the kind that could wake the dead, and sat down at the table, keeping a careful distance between them. The bacon was crispy, the eggs cooked perfectly, the bread still soft inside with a golden crust. It was better than anything she'd eaten in months since her mother died and cooking became just another chore on a failing ranch. They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the scrape of forks against plates and the occasional pop from the fireplace. Clara kept stealing glances at Rowan, trying to reconcile the monster from Pine Hollow's stories with the man who'd made her breakfast and was now eating quietly across from her, his movements economical and precise. "You have questions," Rowan said finally, not looking up from his plate. "I can see them piling up behind your eyes." Clara set down her fork. "A few hundred, actually." "Fair enough." He pushed his plate aside and met her gaze directly. "Ask." Where did she even start? Clara took a breath and chose the most pressing question. What did Marcus mean last night when he said Crow won't let this go? Rowan's jaw tightened. Harlan Crow is a man who believes he's entitled to whatever he wants. Land, power, people. When he decides he wants something, he doesn't stop until he gets it, or until something bigger and meaner makes him stop. Right now, I'm the thing standing in his way. So he'll come after you. He'll try. Rowan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered clearing. He can't touch you legally now. The marriage made sure of that. But he can make trouble for me. And if I'm out of the picture, you'd be a widow. Easy pickings. The casual way he talked about his own potential death sent a chill down Clara's spine. And you're not worried? I'm always worried. That's why I'm still alive. He turned back to her and his expression was serious. But I'm also prepared. This cabin's got sightlines in every direction. There's a rifle by every door, a pistol in every room. I know this mountain better than any man alive, and I've got friends watching the passes. If Crow sends men up here, I'll know they're coming long before they arrive. Clara stood, her hands trembling slightly. I don't want you to die protecting me. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of this. No, you didn't. Rowan's voice softened. Your father asked for my help, and I gave it because letting Crow have you wasn't something I could live with. But you're right, you didn't choose this. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to teach you how to protect yourself. What? How to shoot, how to track, how to survive up here if something happens to me, how to recognize trouble before it finds you. He crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. You want a choice? Real choice comes from capability. Right now you're dependent on me, and that means you're not really free. So I'm going to change that. Clara stared at him, thrown completely off balance. Everything about this man contradicted itself. He was supposed to be dangerous, violent, unstable. Instead, he was offering her independence. He was supposed to claim her as property. Instead, he was teaching her how to survive without him. Why? The question burst out of her, sharp with frustration. Why are you doing all this? What do you get out of it? Rowan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. You want the truth? Yes. 3 years ago, I had a sister, Rebecca. She was 17, beautiful, full of dreams about seeing the world beyond these mountains. A cattle buyer came through town, smooth talker, fancy clothes, made all kinds of promises. He convinced her to leave with him, said he'd take her to San Francisco, show her the ocean, give her the life she deserved. His hands clenched into fists. He sold her to a brothel in Cheyenne. By the time I found her, she'd been there 8 months. She died 2 weeks later. Opium poisoning. Clara's breath caught. Rowan, I hunted that man down, Rowan continued, his voice flat now, emotionless. Found him in a saloon in Laramie, bragging about the money he'd made. I beat him until he couldn't stand, then I dragged him to the sheriff and made sure he went to trial. He got 10 years in territorial prison. It wasn't enough. It'll never be enough. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were dark with old pain. So when I heard what Crow was planning with you, I saw Rebecca all over again. Another girl being sold by the men who should have protected her. And I won't let that happen again. Not if I can stop it. The silence that followed was heavy with things neither of them could say. Clara felt tears prickling at her eyes, not for herself this time, but for a girl she'd never met who dreamed of the ocean and died in a brothel instead. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "about your sister." "So am I." Rowan pushed away from the wall and headed for the door. "Get dressed warm. First lesson starts in 20 minutes. We're going to teach you how to shoot." The clearing behind the cabin had been turned into an improvised shooting range. Rowan had set up targets, old tin cans balanced on fence posts, a piece of wood with a rough circle painted on it, even a scarecrow stuffed with straw that looked vaguely human-shaped and more than a little unsettling. Clara stood in the snow, wearing her heavy coat and a pair of men's gloves that Rowan had given her, and stared at the rifle he'd placed in her hands. It was heavy, cold, and utterly foreign. "It's a Winchester," Rowan said, standing behind her. Not too close, she noticed, always giving her space. "Liver action, holds 15 rounds. It's a good rifle, reliable, accurate, not too heavy for someone your size. This is the one you'll keep by your bed." Clara's hands shook slightly as she held it. "I've never even touched a gun before." "I know, that's why we're starting simple." He pointed to the nearest can, maybe 15 feet away. "See that target? I want you to hit it." "Just like that?" "Just like that." He walked around to face her, his expression patient. "First thing you need to know. A gun is a tool, nothing more. It's not magic, it's not evil, it's just metal and wood that does exactly what you tell it to do. Respect it, but don't fear it." He showed her how to hold the rifle, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze the trigger instead of pulling. His hands guided hers, but only briefly, only when necessary, always asking permission with his eyes before he touched her. "Now, when you're ready, take your shot." Clara sighted down the barrel, trying to remember everything he'd told her. The can seemed impossibly small, impossibly far away. Her heart hammered in her chest. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard into her shoulder, the sound cracking across the clearing like thunder. The bullet hit the fence post 6 inches to the left of the can, sending up a spray of wood splinters. "Good," Rowan said. Clara lowered the rifle and stared at him. "I missed." "But you didn't flinch. You kept your eyes open, and you hit where you were aiming. You were pulling left because you're right-handed but left eye dominant. We'll work on that. Try again." They spent the next hour in the cold, Clara firing round after round until her shoulder ached and her ears rang despite the cotton Rowan had given her to stuff in them. Slowly, incredibly, she started hitting the targets. First the fence post, then the edge of the can, then finally, gloriously, dead center. When the can flew off the post with a satisfying ping, Clara let out a whoop of triumph that surprised them both. Rowan actually smiled, a real smile that transformed his whole face. "There you go, you're a natural." Clara felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the exertion. When was the last time someone had praised her for something other than how well she kept house or how little trouble she caused? "Again," she said, and Rowan set up another target. By the time they went back inside, the sun was high overhead and Clara's arms felt like rubber. But she could hit a target at 20 feet, could load and unload the rifle without fumbling, could clear a jam and check the sights. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd known that morning. Rowan made lunch, soup from a pot he'd had simmering all morning, thick with vegetables and venison, and they ate in companionable silence. Clara found herself watching him again, noticing small things. The way he moved with economy, never wasting energy. The scars on his hands that spoke of hard work and harder fights. The fact that he'd cut the bread into pieces small enough that she could eat with one hand while the other rested her sore shoulder. "Tomorrow we'll work on the pistol," Rowan said as he cleared the dishes. "Day after that, tracking, then trapping, then—" "Why are you in such a hurry to teach me everything?" Clara interrupted. He paused, his back to her. Because Crow won't wait, and neither will Winter. If something happens, you need to be able to survive on your own. You keep saying if something happens, you mean when? Rowan turned to face her, and his expression was grave. I mean, I've made powerful enemies, and eventually one of them is going to get lucky. I'd rather you be ready when that happens. The casual acceptance of his own mortality should have been disturbing. Instead, Clara found it almost refreshing, the honesty of it, after a lifetime of men making promises they had no intention of keeping. What about you? She asked. What will you do? Same thing I do every day. Watch the mountain, tend the traps, make sure we don't run out of firewood or food. It's not exciting, but it's peaceful. He glanced at her. You're welcome to join me if you want, or you can stay here. Your choice. There was that word again, choice. He wielded it like a weapon against her assumptions, against everything she'd been taught about what marriage meant. I'll come, Clara said. I want to see what you do. So she bundled back into her coat and followed Rowan out into the winter forest. He moved through the trees like he was part of them, his steps sure even in deep snow, his eyes constantly scanning for signs that Clara was only beginning to recognize. A track here, a broken branch there. The way the birds went quiet when something larger passed through. They checked his trap line, a series of carefully placed snares and deadfalls that stretched for miles through the forest. Some held rabbits, one had caught a fox with a beautiful red coat, another was empty, but had been sprung by something too smart or too lucky. Rowan reset each trap with practiced efficiency, talking as he worked. Fox pelts are worth good money in town, but you have to cure them right or they're worthless. Rabbits are easy, good meat, useful fur, breed fast so you're not depleting the population. Deer you only take in season and only what you can use. Everything else you leave alone unless you're starving. Clara watched him work, fascinated despite herself. You sound like you care about the animals. I do. They're not just resources, they're part of the mountain, same as me. You take more than you need, the mountain remembers, it'll stop providing. He glanced at her. That probably sounds foolish to you. No, Clara said softly. It sounds like you respect what keeps you alive. Something shifted in Rowan's expression. Surprise, maybe, or appreciation. He finished resetting the trap and stood, brushing snow from his knees. Come on, there's something I want to show you. He led her deeper into the forest, to a place where the trees opened up and the mountain dropped away in a sheer cliff. The view was breathtaking, miles and miles of wilderness stretching out below them, other peaks rising in the distance like frozen waves, the sky so blue it hurt to look at. This is why I stay, Rowan said quietly. Town feels like a cage after you've seen this. All those people pressed together, all those rules about who you can be and what you can want. Up here, there's just you and the mountain. It's honest. Clara stood beside him, the wind pulling at her hair, and for the first time since the wedding, she felt something other than fear or confusion. She felt possibility. It's beautiful, she whispered. It's dangerous, Rowan corrected. Beautiful and dangerous, like most worthwhile things. They stood there until the cold became too much, then made their way back to the cabin as the sun started its descent toward the western peaks. Inside, Rowan built up the fire, while Clara attempted to help with dinner, though her cooking skills were rusty from months of just trying to keep her father fed on nothing. You don't have to, Rowan said, watching her struggle with the pot. I've been cooking for myself for years. So have I. I'm just out of practice with actual ingredients. Clara managed a small smile. My father's idea of a meal was whatever I could make from flour and hope. Rowan took the spoon from her hand gently. Sit. Rest your shoulder. Tomorrow's going to be harder. So Clara sat and watched him cook, this strange man who'd married her to save her and now treated her like a guest instead of a wife. He moved around the small kitchen with the same efficiency he showed in everything else, and Clara found herself wondering about his life before this cabin, before the mountains, before whatever had turned him into the man Pine Hollow feared. Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask. Doesn't mean I'll answer. But his tone wasn't harsh. The things they say about you in town, about men who came up here and didn't come back, is any of that true? Rowan was quiet for a long moment, his back to her as he stirred the pot. Some of it. Men have come up this mountain looking for me. Some came because they heard I had gold hidden somewhere. Some came because they thought a man living alone would be easy to rob. One came because he wanted my land and figured killing me would be simpler than filing a claim. What happened to them? The ones looking for gold went home disappointed. The ones looking to rob me found out I don't keep much worth stealing. And the one who came to kill me, he turned to face her, his eyes dark. I gave him a choice. Leave and never come back, or find out if the stories about me were true. He chose to leave. So you didn't kill him? No. But you would have. Yes. No hesitation, no apology. I don't start fights, Clara, but I finish them. She should have been afraid. A week ago, she would have been. But now, knowing what she knew about Harlan Crow and men like him, knowing what happened to Rebecca Blackwood, knowing that sometimes the only thing standing between survival and destruction was the willingness to be harder than the thing trying to destroy you. Now she just nodded. Good, she said. Rowan's eyebrows rose slightly. Good? Good. Clara met his gaze steadily. Because Crow won't give up, will he? He'll send men, and when he does, I'd rather have someone who knows how to finish fights. Something that might have been respect flickered across Rowan's face. He turned back to the stove and ladled stew into bowls. You're tougher than you look, Clara Hayes. Clara Blackwood, she corrected automatically. Then froze. The name had come out without thought, but now it hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither of them were ready to examine. Rowan set the bowl in front of her without comment, but she caught the slight curve of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close. They ate dinner as the light faded outside and the temperature dropped. Rowan banked the fire for the night, checked the locks on the doors, set a rifle by the window. His nightly ritual, Clara realized. The routine of a man who'd learned to sleep light and wake ready. There's hot water for washing, he said, gesturing to the kettle on the stove. And I put extra blankets on your bed. It's going to be cold tonight, storm coming in from the north. Clara glanced at the window where frost was already forming in intricate patterns. How can you tell? The wind changed direction about an hour ago. The birds went quiet, and my knee aches like hell. Broke it a few years back, and it always knows when weather's coming. He headed for the back room, then paused. If you need anything during the night, knock. I'll hear you. Rowan? Clara stopped him before he could close the door. Thank you. For today. For all of this. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the firelight. Get some rest, Clara. Tomorrow we see if you can handle a pistol. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts and the sound of wind beginning to howl around the cabin's corners. She changed into her nightgown behind the screen, washed in the warm water Rowan had provided, and climbed into the bed that was becoming familiar. The bear fur was heavy and warm, the mattress surprisingly comfortable. Through the cabin's walls she could hear the storm building, wind and snow battering against the windows, the kind of weather that could kill someone caught unprepared. But inside the cabin, she was warm and safe, fed and protected, given space and respect by a man who had every right to demand more from her but chose not to. Clara closed her eyes and let herself acknowledge the truth she'd been avoiding since yesterday. She didn't know what was happening between her and Rowan Blackwood. She didn't know if it would last or fall apart, if Crow would destroy it all, or if they'd find a way to survive. She didn't know if the freedom Rowan promised was real or just another kind of cage. But for the first time in months, maybe years, she felt something other than despair. She felt hope. Outside, the storm raged against the mountain. Inside, Clara Blackwood slept dreamlessly, the rifle Rowan had given her resting against the wall within easy reach, a silent promise that tomorrow she would be stronger than she was today. And in the small room beyond the door, Rowan sat awake in the darkness, his own rifle across his knees, listening to the wind and thinking about the hard truth he hadn't told her yet. That Harlan Crow had been seen in Copper Ridge 2 days ago, asking questions about the trail to Blackwood's cabin. That Marcus had sent word this afternoon that 3 of Crow's men had been spotted buying supplies for a mountain journey. That the storm that was howling around the cabin right now might be the only thing keeping them safe for the next few days. He'd tell her tomorrow. Let her have one more night of peace before the real fight began. Rowan checked his pistol one more time, made sure his knife was sharp, and settled in to wait for whatever the dawn would bring. The mountain night pressed close around the cabin, cold and wild and full of secrets. But inside these walls, something unexpected was taking root, something that might be strong enough to survive what was coming, if they were careful, if they were lucky. If Rowan could keep Clara safe long enough for her to learn how to save herself. The fire burned low, the storm howled, and high on the mountain, two people who'd been strangers 3 days ago began the careful, dangerous work of becoming something more. The storm had buried the world by morning. Clara woke to a silence so complete it felt unnatural, and when she looked out the window, all she could see was white. Snow piled against the glass, drifts that had swallowed the fence posts. The clearing transformed into an alien landscape of curves and shadows. She found Rowan already awake, standing at the door with it cracked open just enough to assess the damage. Cold air poured through the gap, sharp enough to make her gasp. "How bad is it?" she asked, pulling her shawl tighter. "Bad enough." Rowan closed the door and turned to her. His face was tight with something that looked like worry. 3 feet at least, maybe 4 in the drifts. We're snowed in for a few days. Clara's stomach dropped. "Does that happen often?" "Often enough that I keep a month's worth of supplies on hand." He moved to the stove and started building up the fire. "We've got food, water, firewood. We'll be fine." But there was something in his voice that suggested fine was relative. Clara watched him work, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept drifting to the window. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked. Rowan's hand stilled on the coffee pot. He was quiet for a long moment, then set it down and faced her directly. "Crow's men were in Copper Ridge 3 days ago. Marcus sent word yesterday afternoon. They were asking about the trail up here, buying winter gear. The storm probably stopped them, but once it clears, they're coming." Clara's voice was flat. "Yes." She should have been terrified. Part of her was. But another part, the part that had learned to shoot yesterday, the part that had survived her father's failures and her mother's death, and a wedding that felt like a funeral, that part was just angry. "How long do we have?" "Depends on how determined they are and how fast the snow melts. Could be 3 days, could be a week." But Rowan poured coffee with steady hands despite the weight of what he'd just revealed. "Either way, we use the time we've got. Today you learn the pistol. Tomorrow, if the storm breaks, we work on your tracking skills. By the time they get here, you'll know enough to survive if things go wrong." If things go wrong, such a careful phrase for what he really meant. If they kill me. Clara took the coffee he offered and wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "You think they will? Kill you, I mean." "They'll try." Rowan's gray eyes were steady on hers. "Crow doesn't send men to negotiate. He sends them to solve problems. Right now, I'm his problem." "We could leave. Go down the back way you mentioned, get to another town." "And go where?" Rowan interrupted gently. "Crow's got reach all through this territory. We run, he follows. We hide, he finds us. The only way this ends is if we make it too expensive for him to keep coming." He set his cup down. "Besides, I'm done running. Tried that after Rebecca died. Didn't bring her back. Didn't make me feel any better. Just made me a ghost." Clara studied him across the table. This man who'd saved her but wouldn't save himself. "You really think you can stop them?" "I think I can make them wish they'd never come up this mountain." His voice was quiet but absolute. "And I think if we're smart and careful and a little bit lucky, we both walk away from this." The certainty in his words should have comforted her. Instead, it reminded her how much he was willing to risk for someone he barely knew. Clara wanted to ask why, to demand an explanation that made sense, but she'd learned enough about Rowan in 3 days to know he didn't deal in explanations. He dealt in actions. So she drank her coffee and watched him cook breakfast, and when he handed her a pistol after they'd eaten, she took it without hesitation. The pistol was smaller than the rifle, a Colt revolver that fit her hand better than she'd expected. Rowan had cleared a space inside the cabin, moved the table against the wall, set up a target made of straw and cloth at the far end of the room. "Can't go outside in this," he explained. "So we improvise. The principles are the same as the rifle, but the weight's different, the kick's different, and you've got 6 shots instead of 15. Make them count." He stood behind her again, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold cabin, and guided her hands into position. His touch was still careful, still asking permission, but there was an urgency to it now that hadn't been there yesterday. Pull the hammer back with your thumb. That's it. Now sight down the barrel, both eyes open this time, not like the rifle. The target's close, you don't need to be precise, you just need to hit center mass. Clara focused on the target, on the rough circle Rowan had drawn over what would be a man's chest. Her hands were steadier than she'd expected, maybe because she knew now that this wasn't theoretical. Men were coming, and when they arrived, this pistol might be the only thing standing between her and whatever Harlan Crow had planned. She fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, the kick harder than the rifle, but the bullet punched through the target just left of center. Good, Rowan said. Again. They spent the morning drilling, loading, firing, reloading, clearing jams, adjusting for the pistol's tendency to pull right. By the time Rowan called a halt, Clara's hands smelled like gunpowder and her ears rang, but she could put 5 out of 6 shots into the target's center mass without thinking about it. You're a quick study, Rowan said as he cleaned the pistol with a practiced efficiency that spoke of years doing exactly this. Most people take weeks to get where you are in 2 days. Most people aren't expecting armed men to show up at their door. Clara flexed her sore hands. Fear's a good teacher. Rowan glanced up at her, something complicated moving behind his eyes. So is anger. I've seen both in you since yesterday. You're angry at your father. It wasn't a question. Clara sank into the chair by the fire and stared at the flames. Wouldn't you be? He gambled away everything my mother built, drank away everything we had left, then sold me to clear his debts. And the worst part is he thinks he did me a favor. Thinks you're the better option because you're not Harlan Crow, like being slightly less terrible is something to celebrate. He's not wrong about that. Rowan set the clean pistol on the table. Crow would have destroyed you, slowly, methodically. I've seen what he does to women he thinks he owns. Clara looked up sharply. You've seen it? Rowan's jaw tightened. His first wife died falling down the stairs. His second wife died from pneumonia she caught during a particularly cold winter when the doors to her room mysteriously locked from the outside. Both deaths were ruled accidents. Both women had tried to leave him the week before they died. The casual recitation of horror sent ice down Clara's spine. And nobody stopped him? Who would? He owns half the businesses in 3 counties. The sheriff owes him money. The judge is his cousin. Men like Crow don't get stopped. They get richer and more powerful until they finally die, and then some other bastard takes their place. Rowan's voice was bitter. That's why I didn't go to the law when I found out what he wanted with you. The law works for men like him, not against them. Clara thought about her wedding day, about Crow standing at the edge of the churchyard with that smile that promised this wasn't over. She thought about being in his house, locked in a room during winter, nobody hearing her scream. She thought about stairs and accidents and doors that locked from the outside. I'm glad you married me, she said quietly. Rowan's head snapped up, surprise clear on his face. You are? I'm glad I'm here instead of there. I'm even glad I'm learning to shoot and track and survive because you're right. Real choice comes from capability. She met his eyes across the cabin. I'm not glad about how it happened. I'm not glad my father's a coward, or that Crow exists, or that we're sitting here waiting for men with guns to come kill you. But I'm glad I'm here with you instead of there with him. The silence that followed was heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Rowan looked like he wanted to speak, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came. Finally, he just nodded and turned back to the weapons laid out on the table. We should eat something, he said, his voice rougher than usual. Then I'll teach you how to reload under pressure. They fell into a rhythm over the next 2 days while the storm raged outside. Rowan would wake before dawn and check the perimeter, or what he could see of it through the snow. He'd build up the fire, make coffee, prepare breakfast. Clara would wake to warmth and food and the comforting sounds of someone else moving through the cabin. They'd eat together, then train. Pistol work until Clara could draw and fire in one smooth motion. Knife work. How to hold it, where to strike, what to do if someone got too close for a gun. Hand-to-hand basics that made Clara's muscles burn, but also made her feel less helpless. Rowan was patient but demanding, never letting her quit even when her arms shook with exhaustion. Again, he'd say when she wanted to stop. The men coming won't care that you're tired. But he also knew when to push and when to ease back. When Clara's shoulder started bleeding through her dress from the pistol's repeated kick, he stopped immediately and tended the bruise himself, his hands gentle as he applied salve and wrapped it. "I pushed too hard," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." Clara gritted her teeth against the sting. "I need to learn this. Not if it breaks you." His eyes met hers. "There's a difference between strong and broken. I won't be the one who breaks you, Clara." The way he said her name, soft, like something precious, made her chest ache. She was beginning to understand that Rowan Blackwood carried his own kind of scars, the kind that didn't show on skin but shaped everything he did. He'd failed to save his sister, so now he'd tie himself in knots trying to save Clara. He'd been too late once, so now he was desperately trying to be early enough this time. It should have felt like pressure. Instead, it felt like being seen. On the third day, the storm finally broke. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of water dripping from the eaves. The world outside had transformed, everything buried under pristine white. The trees bowed under the weight of snow, the clearing so bright it hurt to look at. Rowan was already outside, a shovel in his hands, clearing a path from the door to the woodshed. Clara watched him work from the window, noting the easy strength in his movements, the way he'd pause occasionally to scan the tree line. Always watching, always ready. She dressed quickly and joined him outside. The air was crisp and clean, cold enough to make her lungs ache. The snow came up past her knees in places, and even following Rowan's cleared path was a struggle. "You should be inside where it's warm," Rowan said when he saw her. "So should you." Clara grabbed a second shovel leaning against the cabin wall. "Show me what needs doing." He looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. Instead, he just nodded, and together they cleared paths to the woodshed, the smokehouse, the small barn where Rowan kept his horses. It was hard work, exhausting work, but Clara found satisfaction in it. The simple accomplishment of moving snow from here to there, of creating order from chaos. When they finally stopped for a break, both breathing hard and covered in snow, Rowan surveyed their work and allowed himself a small smile. "Not bad for a ranch girl." "Ranch girls know how to work." Clara leaned on her shovel. "We just usually don't have to do it in 3 feet of snow." They were heading back to the cabin when Rowan froze, his whole body going tense. Clara felt her heart jump into her throat. "What is it?" "Quiet." He held up a hand, his head tilted slightly. "Listen." Clara strained her ears and heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the forest. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, moving through snow, still distant but getting closer. Inside, Rowan's voice was calm but absolute. "Now." They moved quickly back to the cabin. Rowan grabbed his rifle from beside the door while Clara bolted the heavy wooden shutters over the windows, something Rowan had shown her how to do yesterday. Through the small gap at the edge of one shutter, she could see 3 men on horseback emerging from the tree line. They weren't dressed like mountain men. They wore good coats, expensive hats, and they carried rifles like they knew how to use them. The lead rider was broad-shouldered with a scarred face and eyes that swept the cabin like a predator sizing up prey. "Blackwood," the scarred man called out. "We know you're in there. Mr. Crow sent us to collect what's his." Rowan positioned himself by the window, rifle ready but not yet aimed. "The only thing Crow owns around here is my contempt. Tell him to come collect that himself." The scarred man laughed, a sound without humor. "Funny. We heard you had a sense of humor. We also heard you had something that belongs to Mr. Crow, a wife who should have been his." "Clara Blackwood is my wife, legally married and registered with the territory. Crow's got no claim." "See, that's where you're wrong." The scarred man pulled a paper from his coat. "We got a document here says Thomas Hayes owed Mr. Crow $50,000. Also says that debt could be settled through the marriage of his daughter to Mr. Crow or his designated representative. You ain't designated, Blackwood. That makes your marriage invalid." Clara's blood ran cold. "He forged documents?" "Probably." Rowan's voice was tight. "Or he had someone do it for him. Either way, it doesn't matter. Those papers aren't worth the ink they're printed on." "The territorial judge says different," the scarred man called back. So here's how this works. You send the girl out, we take her back to Mr. Crow, and you get to keep breathing. You try to keep her, and we burn that cabin down around your ears. Rowan's grip tightened on the rifle. Clara could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. 3 men, all armed, all probably experienced. The cabin was defensible but not invincible. And if they really did have a forged document and a crooked judge, no. The word came out of Clara before she'd fully thought it through. She grabbed the pistol from the table where Rowan had left it and checked the cylinder. Loaded. 6 shots. Clara, what are you doing? Rowan's voice was sharp. Making a choice. She moved to the window beside him and called out through the gap in the shutter. My name is Clara Blackwood, and I'm not going anywhere with you. The scarred man's expression darkened. Girl, you don't know what you're choosing. Blackwood's a killer. He'll use you up and throw you away just like he's done with everyone else who trusted him. Funny, Clara called back, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. He's had 3 days to use me up. Instead, he taught me how to shoot. And right now I'm pointing a pistol at your chest through this window. You want to test whether I learned anything? There was a moment of stunned silence. Then the scarred man laughed again, but this time there was uncertainty in it. You don't have the spine for killing. Neither did my husband, apparently, since you're still breathing. Clara's finger rested lightly on the trigger. But I'm angry enough to find out if I do. My father sold me like cattle. Harlan Crow thinks he can forge papers and steal me anyway. And you rode up this mountain to drag me down it like a sack of grain. So yes, I think I might have the spine for it after all. Beside her, Rowan made a sound that might have been surprise or respect or something in between. Clara, I'm done being afraid, she told him, not taking her eyes off the men outside. I'm done being helpless. You gave me a choice, Rowan. I'm choosing to fight. The scarred man's face had lost its smug certainty. He exchanged glances with his companions, and Clara saw the moment they realized this wasn't going to be the easy job they'd expected. Last chance, the scarred man said, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. Come out now, and nobody gets hurt. Rowan's response was to raise his rifle and fire a single shot that kicked up snow 2 feet in front of the lead horse. The animal reared, nearly throwing its rider, and the other horses shied back nervously. That was a warning, Rowan called out, his voice carrying across the clearing like judgment. The next one goes through flesh. You've got 10 seconds to turn those horses around and ride back down this mountain. After that, I stop being polite. The scarred man fought his horse back under control, his face twisted with rage. Crow's not going to forget this, Blackwood. He's going to... Rowan fired again. This time the bullet took the man's hat clean off his head, sending it spinning into the snow. The message was unmistakable. 5 seconds, Rowan said. The 3 men exchanged looks. Clara could see them weighing their options. The money Crow was probably paying them against the very real possibility of dying in the snow. The scarred man's hand moved toward his rifle. Clara fired. Not at him, but at the tree branch above his head. The branch cracked and dumped its load of snow directly onto him and his horse. The combination of gunshot and sudden snow shower was too much. The horse bolted, carrying its cursing rider back toward the tree line. The other 2 men didn't wait to see what would happen next. They wheeled their horses and followed, leaving deep tracks in the snow and taking any pretense of authority with them. Clara and Rowan watched until the 3 riders disappeared into the forest. Even then, Rowan didn't lower his rifle. He stayed at the window, tense and alert, for another full minute before finally setting the weapon aside. They'll be back, he said quietly. I know. Clara's hands were shaking now that the danger had passed, adrenaline making her voice unsteady. But not today. Rowan turned to her, and his expression was complex, pride mixed with concern, mixed with something that looked almost like wonder. That was either very brave or very foolish. Can it be both? Clara set the pistol down before her trembling hands could drop it. You said real choice comes from capability. Well, I chose. I chose you over Crow. I chose this cabin over his house, and I chose to fight instead of being dragged away like property. You could have been killed. Rowan's voice was rough. If that man had raised his rifle instead of reaching for it, if either of the others had fired first, but they didn't, we scared them off. Clara met his eyes directly. Together. That's what marriage is supposed to be, isn't it? Facing things together? Rowan stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached out and took her shaking hand in his steady one. His calloused fingers were warm against her cold skin. "Clara Blackwood," he said softly, "you are the bravest person I've ever met." The words hit her harder than any bullet could have. Clara felt tears prickling at her eyes, not from fear or sadness, but from the simple shock of being seen, truly seen, by someone who understood what bravery actually cost. "I learned from a good teacher," she managed. They stood there in the dim cabin, hands clasped, while outside the sun climbed higher and began the slow work of melting the snow. Neither of them spoke about what had just happened or what it meant. They didn't talk about the fact that Clara had just publicly chosen Rowan over freedom, or that Rowan had just witnessed her become the kind of person who could stare down armed men. They didn't need to. Some truths didn't require words. Finally, Rowan squeezed her hand once and let go. "We need to prepare. They'll go back to Crow, tell him what happened. He'll send more men, or he'll come himself. Either way, we've got maybe 2 days. Then we use them." Clara's voice was steady now. "Show me everything else I need to know. Teach me how to turn this cabin into a fortress. Make me ready." Rowan nodded, and something that might have been a smile touched his lips. "Yes, ma'am." They spent the rest of that day and all of the next transforming the cabin into exactly what Clara had demanded, a fortress. Rowan showed her the rifle he'd hidden in the rafters, the pistol behind the loose board near the fireplace, the knife sheathed under the table's edge. He taught her the sight lines, the blind spots, where to position herself for the best defensive advantage. They moved supplies into the cabin's small root cellar: ammunition, food, water. Rowan showed Clara the escape tunnel he'd dug years ago, hidden behind a false panel in the back room that led out to the forest 30 yards from the cabin. "If it comes to it," he told her, his voice serious, "you go through that tunnel and you run. Don't look back. Don't wait for me. There's a cache 2 miles north with supplies and a map to the nearest town. You follow that map and you start over." "What about you?" Clara demanded. "I'll buy you time." Said like it was simple, like his life was a fair trade for her freedom. Clara grabbed his arm, stopping him mid-motion. "No. If we run together. If we fight together. That's the deal, Rowan. I'm not leaving you to die for me." Rowan looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. "You don't understand what you're asking. Crow will send enough men to—" "I don't care." Clara's voice was fierce. "You gave me a choice. You gave me freedom. You gave me dignity when everyone else saw me as currency. So now I'm choosing to stand with you, whatever comes." For a long moment, Rowan just stared at her. Then, moving slowly like he was afraid she might vanish, he cupped her face with one rough hand. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, gentle despite the violence those hands were capable of. "All right," he whispered. "Together." Clara leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth of his palm against her skin, and realized with a start that somewhere in the past 5 days, this forced marriage had transformed into something real. She didn't love Rowan Blackwood. Not yet, maybe not ever in the way romance novels described, but she trusted him with her life. She respected him more than any man she'd ever known. And she'd fight beside him against whatever darkness came down that mountain. That was its own kind of love. Hard and practical, and forged in necessity, but no less real for it. Outside, the sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the snow in shades of gold and purple. Beautiful and dangerous, just like Rowan had said. And somewhere down in the valley, Harlan Crow was plotting his next move, gathering his forces, preparing to take what he believed he owned. But high on the mountain, in a cabin that had become a home, 2 people stood together and made themselves ready for war. The reckoning was coming. And this time, Clara Blackwood would not be a prize to be won. She would be a force to be reckoned with. They came with the dawn 2 days later, not 3 men this time, but 7. And Harlan Crow rode at their head like a general leading his army. Clara spotted them first from her position at the window, where she'd been keeping watch since 4 in the morning, unable to sleep, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. "Rowan," she said quietly, and he was beside her in seconds, rifle already in hand. Through the gap in the shutters, they watched the riders approach. Crow sat tall in his saddle, his silver hair catching the early light, his expensive coat pristine despite the journey up the mountain. The 6 men with him were harder, meaner versions of the 3 who'd come before, hired guns with dead eyes and well-worn weapons. "He brought an army," Clara whispered. "He brought witnesses." Rowan's voice was tight. "He wants this to look legal. Wants people to say he tried to do things the right way before he did them the wrong way." Crow pulled his horse to a stop 30 yards from the cabin, just outside comfortable rifle range. He sat there for a moment, surveying the fortified windows, the cleared sight lines, the preparations that made it clear this wouldn't be easy. Then he smiled, that same predatory smile Clara had seen at her wedding. "Rowan Blackwood," he called out, his voice cultured and smooth. "I believe we have business to discuss." Rowan opened the door just wide enough to be seen, but not wide enough to be a target. "We've got nothing to discuss, Crow. Turn around and ride back down while you still can." Such hostility, and here I've ridden all this way in good faith to resolve a simple misunderstanding. Crow gestured to one of his men, who produced a leather folder. "I have documents here, properly notarized and filed with the territorial office, that prove Clara Hayes was promised to me as settlement for her father's debts. Your marriage to her, while creative, was executed without proper authority and is therefore null and void." "Those documents are forgeries," Rowan said flatly. "The judge in Copper Ridge disagrees, as does the territorial marshal." Crow's smile widened. "I've brought them both with me, actually. They're waiting at the bottom of the mountain with a warrant for your arrest on charges of kidnapping and fraud. All you have to do is surrender the girl, and this unpleasantness can be resolved peacefully." Clara felt ice slide down her spine. A judge and a marshal, both bought and paid for, no doubt, but with enough legal authority to make Crow's claim look legitimate. If Rowan surrendered her, she'd disappear into Crow's house, and the law would call it justice. If he didn't surrender her, he'd be hunted as a criminal. She stepped up beside Rowan in the doorway, the pistol heavy in her hand. "My name is Clara Blackwood, Mr. Crow, and I'm not going anywhere with you." Crow's eyes fixed on her, and Clara saw the flash of rage behind his civilized mask. "Mrs. Hayes, you've clearly been deceived by this man. He's filled your head with lies about me, made you believe you had choices you don't actually have. But I'm a patient man. I'm willing to forgive this indiscretion if you'll simply be reasonable." "Reasonable," Clara repeated, her voice sharp. "Like your first wife was reasonable when she fell down the stairs? Like your second wife was reasonable when she caught pneumonia in a locked room?" The smile vanished from Crow's face. Several of his men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Apparently even hired guns had limits to what they'd ignore. "Careful, girl," Crow said, his voice dropping into something cold and dangerous. "You're making accusations you can't prove about tragic accidents that have nothing to do with current circumstances." "No, what's tragic is that you think you can buy me like you've bought everything else." Clara raised the pistol, not quite aiming at him, but making it clear she could. "I made my choice. I chose Rowan Blackwood. I chose this cabin. I chose a life where I'm a person instead of property, and no forged document or crooked judge is going to change that." Crow's facade cracked completely. "You ungrateful little fool. Do you have any idea what I'm offering you? A house in town, fine clothes, social standing, security, and you throw it all away for this?" He gestured dismissively at Rowan. "A mountain hermit with a violent past and no future? A man who lives like an animal because he can't function in civilized society? Better an honest animal than a civilized monster." Clara's voice didn't waver. "At least Rowan's violence is used to protect, not to control. At least he sees me as a human being worthy of choice instead of a thing to be acquired." Rowan's hand found the small of her back, a brief touch of support and warning. "Last chance, Crow. Take your men and your forged papers and ride away. There's nothing for you here." Crow's laugh was ugly. "Nothing? I think you underestimate your situation, Blackwood. I have 7 armed men. You have yourself and a ranch girl playing at being dangerous. The mathematics aren't in your favor." "The mathematics are fine," Rowan said calmly. "I've got high ground, fortified positions, and nothing to lose. You've got men who are wondering if you're paying them enough to die in the snow for your wounded pride. Run the numbers again." One of Crow's men, a younger one with nervous eyes, actually started turning his horse. Crow's voice cracked like a whip. "Stay where you are, Jenkins, unless you want to forfeit your pay, and answer to me about breach of contract. Jenkins froze, but didn't turn back around completely. The other men exchanged glances, and Clara could see the calculation happening. How much was Crow paying versus how much was their life worth? "You can't win this, Blackwood," Crow said, his composure returning. "Even if you kill every man here, the marshal will come. Then the army. Then federal agents. You'll be hunted from here to California. And when they catch you, and they will catch you, they'll hang you for murder and kidnapping. Is that really how you want this to end?" Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, calm as discussing the weather, "You're assuming I care about ending up at the end of a rope. You're assuming I'm not willing to trade my life for hers. But you know what I think, Crow? I think you've never met anyone who actually meant it when they said they'd die before letting you win. I think you've spent your whole life buying and bullying people into submission, and you don't know what to do with someone who'd rather burn it all down than give you an inch." He raised his rifle and aimed it directly at Crow's chest. "So here's my counteroffer. You get on that horse, and you ride away right now, or I put a bullet through your heart and deal with the consequences. Your men can collect your body, or they can run. Their choice. But you don't leave this mountain with Clara. Not today. Not ever." The clearing went absolutely silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Crow stared down the barrel of Rowan's rifle, and for the first time, Clara saw something like fear flicker across his face. "You're bluffing," Crow said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Try me." The standoff stretched for 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours. Then Crow made his mistake. His hand dropped toward the pistol at his hip, his eyes calculating the distance, the angles, thinking he could draw faster than Rowan could fire. Rowan shot him. The bullet took Crow in the right shoulder, spinning him sideways in his saddle. His horse reared, and Crow would have fallen if one of his men hadn't grabbed his reins. Blood bloomed across that expensive coat, dark and spreading. Crow screamed, not from pain but from rage. "Kill them! Kill them both!" 3 of the 6 hired guns actually reached for their weapons. The other 3, including Jenkins, wheeled their horses and fled back down the mountain. Clara didn't blame them. They'd signed on for intimidation, not a shooting war. Rowan fired twice more in rapid succession. One bullet took the gun out of a man's hand, sending it spinning into the snow. The other hit a second man in the leg, dropping him from his saddle with a howl of pain. The third man got his rifle up and fired, but he rushed the shot and the bullet went wide, punching through the cabin's wooden siding a foot from Clara's head. She didn't freeze, didn't panic. She stepped fully into the doorway, raised her pistol with both hands the way Rowan had taught her, and fired. Her bullet caught the man in the shoulder. Not a killing shot, but enough to make him drop his rifle and clutch at the wound, his face white with shock. "Next one, center mass," Clara called out, her voice surprisingly steady. "Your choice." The wounded man looked at his companions, one cradling a shattered hand, another writhing in the snow with blood soaking through his pants. Crow slumped in his saddle and barely conscious. He made the smart choice. He turned his horse and ran. The man with the shattered hand followed immediately. That left only the man Clara had shot, still mounted but clearly weighing his options. "Help me!" Crow gasped, his face gray with pain and blood loss. "Help me, damn you!" The hired gun looked at Crow, then at Rowan and Clara standing together in the doorway, weapons ready and clearly willing to use them. He made a decision that probably saved his life. "You ain't paying me enough for this," he said, and rode away, leaving Crow and the man with the leg wound bleeding in the snow. Rowan kept his rifle trained on Crow as he stepped out of the cabin. "Clara, stay inside." "No." She followed him out, pistol still in hand. "Together, remember?" They approached Crow carefully, watching for any sign of treachery, but the fight had gone out of him along with a significant amount of blood. He slumped against his horse's neck, his breathing labored, his face the color of old paper. "You shot me," he said, like he couldn't quite believe it. "You actually shot me." "You drew first." Rowan's voice was flat. "Everyone who was here saw it. Self-defense." "No one will believe you," Crow gasped. "They will, when the 3 men who ran tell their story. They will when your own wounded men confirm you gave the order to kill us. They will when Clara testifies about what you tried to do." Rowan crouched down beside Crow's horse, his rifle still ready, but pointed away. You made a mistake, Crow. You thought you were untouchable, thought your money and your connections made you immune to consequences. But up here, none of that matters. Up here, you're just a man who drew on the wrong person. Crow's laugh was wet and painful. You think this ends with me? The judge, the marshal? They'll still come. Let them. Clara stepped up beside Rowan, her pistol steady in her hands. Let them come and hear about how you forged documents, how you tried to buy me like cattle, how you brought armed men to murder the man I chose to marry. Let them hear about your dead wives and your locked doors and all the other women who've disappeared into your house. You want to make this a legal matter? Fine. We'll make it legal. Something that might have been respect flickered in Crow's pain-glazed eyes. You're not what I expected. No, Clara said. I'm not. I'm... The sound of hoofbeats made them both turn. For a moment, Clara's heart seized, thinking Crow's men were returning. But it was Marcus Webb who emerged from the tree line, leading 4 other riders, mountain men by the look of them, armed and alert. Heard gunfire, Marcus said as he pulled his horse to a stop. Figured you might need witnesses to what happened here. His eyes swept the scene, the wounded men, Crow bleeding in his saddle, the spent shells in the snow. Looks like I was right. Marcus. Rowan's relief was palpable. Perfect timing. Always is. Marcus dismounted and approached Crow with the clinical detachment of someone who'd seen plenty of wounded men. This is bad, Crow. Shoulder wounds bleeding pretty good. You need a doctor soon or you'll bleed out in the snow. Then help me, Crow gasped. Oh, we'll help you. Get you down to Pine Hollow. Let the doc fix you up. Then you can explain to the territorial marshal, the real one, not your bought judge, what you were doing up here with 7 armed men threatening a legally married couple. Marcus's smile was cold. The funny thing about corruption, it works great until someone with actual authority finds out about it. And I happen to know the territorial marshal personally. He's an honest man. He's going to be real interested in your forged documents. While Marcus and his men secured Crow and the other wounded man, Rowan turned to Clara. You all right? She looked down at the pistol in her hands, still warm from firing, then up at Rowan's face. I shot a man. You defended yourself, defended us. Rowan's voice was gentle. That's not the same thing as shooting someone in cold blood. I know, Clara's hands started to shake now that the adrenaline was fading. I thought I'd feel different. Worse, maybe. But I just feel relieved that we're alive. Rowan took the pistol from her trembling hands and set it aside, then pulled her into his arms. It was the first time he'd held her like this. Fully, completely, without hesitation. Clara pressed her face into his chest and let herself shake, let herself process what had just happened, let herself be vulnerable now that the danger had passed. You were magnificent, Rowan said softly into her hair. Brave and strong and absolutely magnificent. Clara let out a laugh that was half sob. I was terrified. Brave isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs doing despite the fear. He pulled back enough to look at her face. You stood beside me. You fought beside me. You chose this even when you could have surrendered and been safe. Safe in Crow's house isn't safe at all. Clara wiped at her eyes. I'd rather face a dozen armed men with you than spend one day alone with him. Marcus cleared his throat diplomatically. Hate to interrupt, but we should get moving. Crow needs medical attention, and we need to get these men down the mountain before dark. You two coming? Rowan looked at Clara, the question clear in his eyes. She could stay here, safe in the cabin, while he went down to deal with the legal aftermath. Or she could go with him and face whatever came next. Clara thought about the girl who'd stood at that altar 6 days ago, terrified and helpless, being traded like property. She thought about how much had changed since then, how much she'd changed. That girl would have stayed behind, would have hidden and hoped someone else would fix things. But Clara Blackwood was not that girl anymore. We're coming, she said firmly. They made the journey down the mountain slowly, accounting for the wounded men who had to be supported in their saddles, and the treacherous path made worse by melting snow. Crow drifted in and out of consciousness, his expensive coat now ruined by blood and mud. The man with the leg wound bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming with every jolt. Clara rode beside Rowan on the horse they'd taken from Crow's fleeing men, and she couldn't help but notice how the mountain men who'd come with Marcus treated Rowan. Not with fear, but with respect. They called him by name, asked his opinion, deferred to his judgment. These weren't men afraid of the mountain hermit. These were men who knew him and trusted him. "They're your friends," Clara said quietly. "Some of them. Others are just neighbors who know Crow needed stopping." Rowan glanced at her. "Mountain folk take care of their own. When Marcus sent word that Crow was coming with an army, 6 men volunteered to ride up, and even the odds. They would have fought for you." "They would have fought for what was right," Rowan's voice was firm. "There's a difference." Pine Hollow came into view as the sun reached its zenith, the town looking smaller and shabbier than Clara remembered from her wedding day. But there was a crowd gathered in the street, and at its center stood a man in a marshal's uniform talking to a very nervous-looking judge. The real territorial marshal, Clara realized. The honest one Marcus had mentioned. The crowd went silent as their party rode in. Clara could see faces she recognized: Mrs. Patterson from the general store, Mr. Chen from the boarding house, Sarah Dennison with her mother. They stared at Clara like they were seeing a ghost, and she supposed in a way they were. They'd expected her to disappear into Crow's house or die on the mountain. They hadn't expected her to ride back into town armed and bloody and very much alive. The marshal stepped forward, his hand resting on his pistol. He was an older man, probably 50, with gray in his mustache and hard eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. "That's far enough. Someone want to tell me what happened up on that mountain?" Rowan dismounted and helped Clara down before addressing the marshal. "Marshal Hendricks, I'm Rowan Blackwood. This is my wife, Clara. 6 days ago, we were legally married in this town's church, witnessed by Reverend Morris, and properly registered with the territorial office. This morning, Harlan Crow rode up to my cabin with 7 armed men and attempted to take my wife by force, claiming he had legal authority to do so." "He does have legal authority," the nervous judge interjected. "I signed the order myself based on forged documents," Marcus interrupted, pulling papers from his saddlebag. "These are the actual debt agreements between Thomas Hayes and various creditors, including Harlan Crow. You'll note that none of them mention Clara Hayes as collateral. You'll also note that all debts were paid in full by Rowan Blackwood on the day of the wedding, properly witnessed and notarized." Marshal Hendricks took the papers and examined them carefully. His expression darkened with each page. "Judge Morrison, you signed an order to seize a legally married woman based on what evidence?" The judge turned pale. "Mr. Crow provided documentation that was forged," Clara said, stepping forward. "And he knew it was forged, just like he knows that his first wife didn't fall down those stairs by accident, just like he knows what happened to his second wife in that locked room." A murmur rippled through the crowd. These were old rumors, whispered suspicions that nobody had dared voice aloud. But here was Clara Hayes, no, Clara Blackwood, standing in the street and saying them out loud. "Young lady, those are serious accusations," Marshal Hendricks said, but his tone wasn't dismissive. He was listening. "I have serious evidence." Clara pointed to Crow, barely conscious in his saddle. "He brought 7 men to murder my husband and kidnap me. When my husband defended us, Crow drew his weapon first. Multiple witnesses can confirm this. He gave the order to kill us both. My husband shot him in self-defense." "She's lying," Crow gasped, but his voice was weak. "She's been manipulated by Blackwood. Doesn't know what she's saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." Clara's voice rang clear across the street. "I'm saying that you tried to buy me like cattle. I'm saying you forged documents and bribed a judge to get what you wanted. I'm saying you brought armed men to commit murder. And I'm saying I shot one of those men myself when he fired at us first." The crowd gasped. Sarah Dennison's eyes went wide. Mrs. Patterson actually smiled. Marshal Hendricks studied Clara for a long moment, then turned to Marcus. "You witnessed this?" "Me and 4 other men. We saw Crow give the order to kill them. We saw Blackwood shoot him in self-defense after Crow drew first. We saw Blackwood defend herself when one of Crow's hired guns fired at her." Marcus's voice was steady and factual. Everything she said is true. The marshal turned to Crow's wounded men. That how it happened? The man with the shattered hand, clearly in too much pain to lie effectively, nodded. Boss told us to kill them. Blackwood shot first, but only after Boss reached for his gun. We never should have ridden up there. Wasn't worth it. Judge Morrison looked like he wanted to sink through the ground. Marshal Hendricks' expression could have frozen the sun. Judge Morrison, you're under arrest for corruption and abuse of office. Harlan Crow, soon as the doc patches you up, you're under arrest for attempted murder, kidnapping, and fraud. The marshal's voice was hard as iron. And I'm going to personally investigate every business dealing, every land acquisition, and every suspicious death connected to you for the past 20 years. If even half of what I suspect is true, you'll hang. Crow tried to speak, but whatever he meant to say was lost in a fit of coughing that brought up blood. The doctor, who'd been hovering at the edge of the crowd, rushed forward with his bag. Get him to my office, the doctor ordered. He's lost a lot of blood. I can save him, but he needs surgery now. As they carried Crow away on a stretcher, Marshal Hendricks turned back to Rowan and Clara. I'll need full statements from both of you, and I'll want to talk to every witness. This is going to be a long investigation. We'll cooperate fully, Rowan said. See that you do. The marshal's eyes softened slightly. For what it's worth, I'm sorry you were put in this position, Mrs. Blackwood. A woman shouldn't have to fight for the right to choose her own husband. No, Clara agreed. She shouldn't, but I'm glad I could. The crowd started to disperse, though Clara could feel their eyes on her, could hear the whispers starting. But they weren't whispers of pity anymore. They were whispers of shock, respect, even admiration. The girl who'd been sold at auction had shot back. Thomas Hayes pushed through the crowd then, his face haggard and guilty. Clara, Not now, Father. Clara's voice was tired, but not cruel. I'm alive. I'm safe. And that's more than you had any right to expect after what you did. We'll talk eventually, but not today. Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face, and backed away. Rowan's hand found Clara's, his fingers intertwining with hers. Ready to give that statement? Clara looked at the marshal's office, at the town that had watched her wedding like a funeral, at the mountains rising in the distance where their cabin waited. She thought about everything that had happened in 6 impossible days, the fear and the fighting, the shooting lessons and the shooting gallery, the moment she'd chosen to stand beside Rowan instead of surrender to Crow. She thought about the girl she'd been and the woman she was becoming. Ready, she said, and together they walked into the marshal's office to tell the truth about what happened on the mountain, where a forced marriage became a choice, and a choice became a stand, and a stand became something that might, eventually, become love. The marshal's office smelled like old coffee and older tobacco, the kind of permanent scent that had seeped into the wooden walls over years of men sitting in hard chairs and telling hard truths. Clara sat across from Marshal Hendricks with Rowan beside her, their hands still linked on top of the scarred desk, and told the story from the beginning. She told him about her father's debts and Crow's proposition. She told him about the wedding that felt like a funeral and the mountain cabin that became a sanctuary. She told him about the shooting lessons and the 3 men who came first, about the 7 who came after, about the moment Crow reached for his gun and Rowan fired to protect them both. Marshal Hendricks listened without interrupting, his weathered face impassive, taking notes in a careful hand. When Clara finished, he set down his pen and looked at her with something that might have been respect. That's quite a story, Mrs. Blackwood. It's the truth, Clara said simply. I believe you. The marshal leaned back in his chair. I've been hearing rumors about Harlan Crow for years, but he's always been too rich, too connected, too careful to get caught. This time he got sloppy. This time he went after someone who had the courage to fight back. He glanced at Rowan. And someone willing to stand beside her while she did. Rowan's grip on Clara's hand tightened slightly. What happens now? Now I build a case. Talk to witnesses, examine documents, dig into Crow's business dealings. The attempted murder charge is solid. We've got multiple witnesses and his own wounded men confirming he gave the order to kill you. The fraud charge should stick once I prove those documents were forged. And once I start investigating his past, the marshal's expression hardened. Let's just say I think we're going to find a lot more than two suspicious deaths. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying since the wedding finally beginning to ease. So we're safe. Crow can't come after us again? He's facing murder charges and a rope if convicted. He's finished, Mrs. Blackwood. Whatever power he had in this territory died the moment he rode up that mountain. Marshal Hendricks stood and extended his hand to Rowan. You did the right thing protecting your wife. Any man would have done the same. Rowan shook the offered hand, but his voice was cautious. And the shooting? I put 3 men in the doctor's office. All in self-defense with multiple witnesses to confirm it. You're clear. The marshal's eyes moved between them. Though I'd suggest you both stay in town for a few days while I finish taking statements. I'll need you available if I have more questions. They emerged from the marshal's office into late afternoon sunlight that painted Pine Hollow's main street in gold. The crowd had dispersed, but Clara could still feel eyes watching from windows, could still hear the whisper of gossip following them like smoke. She'd become a story now, the girl who was sold at auction and shot her way to freedom. Part of her hated the attention. Another part was fiercely glad that her story would make it harder for men like Crow to do this to someone else. We should find a room at the boarding house, Rowan said quietly. I don't want to ride back up the mountain in the dark, and you need rest. Clara realized she was exhausted, bone-deep tired in a way that had nothing to do with the physical journey and everything to do with the emotional weight of the past week. A real bed sounds like heaven. They walked to Chen's boarding house, and Clara noticed how people moved aside for them on the wooden sidewalk. Not with fear exactly, but with a new kind of wariness mixed with respect. Rowan Blackwood was no longer just the dangerous hermit. He was the man who'd stood against Harlan Crow and won. And Clara was no longer just Thomas Hayes's unfortunate daughter. She was the woman who'd fought beside him. Mr. Chen greeted them at the boarding house door with a deep bow. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, I have my best room available for you. No charge. Rowan started to protest, but Chen held up his hand. Please, what you did today, standing up to Crow, it means something. That man has terrorized this town for too long. You showed us that he can be stopped. His eyes moved to Clara. And you, Mrs. Blackwood, you showed every woman in Pine Hollow that we don't have to accept what men like him decide for us. Clara felt tears prickling at her eyes. Thank you, Mr. Chen. The room was simple but clean, with a real bed covered in a handmade quilt, a washstand with fresh water, and windows that looked out over the town toward the mountains. Rowan set their bags down and turned to Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. I can sleep on the floor, he offered, or see if Chen has another room. Clara looked at this man who'd married her to save her, who'd taught her to shoot and fight and survive, who'd stood beside her when 7 armed men came calling and never once suggested she surrender to make things easier. This man who was still, after everything, trying to give her space and choice and freedom. Rowan, she said softly, we just shot our way out of an attempted kidnapping together. I think we're past the point of needing separate rooms. Something shifted in his expression, relief mixed with something warmer, something that made Clara's heart beat faster. You sure? I'm sure. Clara moved closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of darker gray in his storm cloud eyes. I chose you 6 days ago when I said I do. I chose you 3 days ago when Crow's men came the first time. I chose you this morning when I could have surrendered and didn't. I'm choosing you now, Rowan Blackwood, not because I have to. Not because I'm afraid, because I want to. Rowan's hand came up to cup her face, his calloused thumb brushing across her cheekbone just like he'd done in the cabin. Clara, His voice caught. I never expected this. Any of this. I thought I was just buying you time, giving you a chance to escape eventually. I never thought that I'd want to stay? Clara finished for him. She covered his hand with hers, holding it against her face. Neither did I. But somewhere between the shooting lessons and the snow shoveling, between watching you cook breakfast and watching you face down 7 armed men without flinching, I realized something. You're the first man who's ever seen me as a person instead of a problem to solve or a prize to win. You gave me weapons and taught me how to use them. You gave me choices when everyone else just gave me orders. You gave me respect when I'd forgotten what that felt like. You earned it, Rowan said roughly. Every bit of it. The way you stood in that doorway this morning, the way you fired without hesitation, the way you chose to fight instead of surrender, Clara, you're the strongest person I've ever met. I learned from a good teacher. Clara smiled through the tears that were falling now. A teacher who showed me that strength isn't just about being willing to fight. It's about knowing what's worth fighting for. Rowan leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, to change her mind, to maintain the careful distance they'd kept for 6 days. Claire didn't pull away. Instead, she rose on her toes and met him halfway, and when their lips touched, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, two people learning each other after a week of careful boundaries. Then Claire's hands fisted in Rowan's shirt, and his arms came around her waist, and it deepened into something that spoke of shared danger and shared survival, and the fierce joy of being alive when they could have been dead. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Rowan rested his forehead against hers. "I'm going to court you properly," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Take you to dinner, bring you flowers, do all the things I should have done before we got married. You deserve that." Clara laughed, the sound wet with tears and joy. "Rowan, we survived a gunfight together this morning. I think we can skip straight to the part where we build a life." Still, he pulled back enough to look at her face. "You were robbed of a real courtship, a real wedding, a real choice about how this all began. I can't give you those things back, but I can give you this. The chance to fall in love slowly, properly, without fear or coercion hanging over us. If you'll let me." Clara felt her heart expand in her chest, so full of emotion she thought it might burst. Here was this man, this beautiful, broken, healing man, offering her romance after they'd already said their vows, offering her the courtship that should have come first but somehow meant more coming second. "I'd like that," she whispered. "I'd like that very much." They spent that evening in the boarding house dining room, eating Mrs. Chen's excellent cooking and fielding questions from the other guests who'd heard about the shooting on the mountain. Rowan answered with his characteristic brevity, but Clara noticed how his hand kept finding hers under the table, how his eyes kept seeking her out across the room, how he smiled when she told the story of shooting the branch above the scarred man's head and dumping snow on him. When they finally retired to their room, Rowan insisted on taking the chair by the window while Clara took the bed. She fell asleep to the sight of him keeping watch, rifle across his knees, and the knowledge that she was safe in a way she'd never been before. The next 3 days passed in a strange kind of limbo. Marshal Hendricks conducted his investigation, interviewing witnesses and examining documents. The doctor confirmed that Crow would survive his shoulder wound but would never have full use of his right arm again. Judge Morrison resigned in disgrace and fled to California before he could be formally arrested. 3 of Crow's business partners were brought in for questioning about forged land deeds and intimidation tactics. And slowly, inevitably, the truth about Harlan Crow began to emerge. A former housemaid came forward and testified about the locked doors and the screams she'd heard from the second wife's room. A banker produced records showing suspicious transfers of property from widows and orphans at prices far below market value. A town in the next county reported similar attempted kidnappings of young women to settle family debts. The man who'd seemed untouchable was revealed to be exactly what everyone had whispered, but nobody had dared say aloud. A predator who'd used his wealth and connections to take what he wanted and destroy anyone who stood in his way. On the 4th day, Marshal Hendricks came to the boarding house and found Clara and Rowan having breakfast in the dining room. "It's over," he said simply. "Crow's been formally charged with attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The territorial prosecutor is adding charges related to his wives' deaths. He's looking at a rope or life in prison at minimum." The marshal sat down across from them, suddenly looking very tired. "I've also arrested 4 of his associates, seized his properties pending investigation, and frozen his bank accounts. His empire is finished." Clara felt something release in her chest that she hadn't even realized she'd been holding. "So we can go home?" "You can go anywhere you want, Mrs. Blackwood. You're free." The marshal smiled slightly. "Though I'd appreciate it if you stayed in the territory for the trial. Your testimony will be crucial." "We'll stay," Rowan said, and Clara heard the promise in those words. Not just staying for the trial. Staying, period. Building a life here together. After the marshal left, Clara turned to Rowan. "We should go see my father." Rowan's expression grew cautious. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" "No." Clara stood, smoothing down her dress. "But it needs to be done anyway." They found Thomas Hayes at the ranch, or what was left of it. The house looked shabbier than Clara remembered, the fences in need of repair, the barn listing slightly to one side. Her father was in the yard trying to fix a broken wagon wheel, but his hands shook too badly to hold the tools steady. He looked up when he heard them approaching, and Clara saw the shame and hope and fear warring in his expression. "Clara, Rowan, I didn't expect... I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." "I wasn't sure I did either," Clara said honestly, "but we need to talk." They sat on the porch while the afternoon sun slanted across the yard, and Clara told her father everything she hadn't been able to say at the wedding. She told him about her fear and her anger. She told him how it felt to be traded like cattle. She told him that while she was grateful Rowan had turned out to be a good man, that didn't excuse what Thomas had done. Her father listened with tears streaming down his face, not trying to defend himself, just absorbing the weight of his failures. When Clara finally fell silent, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness. I destroyed everything your mother built, drank away everything we had, and then when I'd ruined everything else, I sold you too." He wiped at his eyes with shaking hands. "The only decent thing I did was find Rowan instead of letting Crow have you. And even that was motivated by guilt, not love." Clara felt her own tears falling. "I know." "I'm going to do better," Thomas continued. "I've stopped drinking, started fixing up the ranch. It'll take years to rebuild what I destroyed, but I'm going to try. Not because I think it'll make you forgive me, just because I owe it to your mother's memory to be the man she thought I could be." Clara looked at this broken man who'd been her father, and she felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but maybe the beginning of a possibility of eventual understanding. "I can't come back here," she said gently. "My home is with Rowan now, up on the mountain. But maybe someday, when you've proven you meant what you just said, maybe we can find a way to be family again. Not like before. Something new." Hope flickered across Thomas's face. "I'd like that. I'd like that more than anything." Rowan, who'd been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "The ranch needs work. I could help with that. Not moving back, but maybe coming down once a week, teaching you how to repair what's broken." He glanced at Clara. "If that's all right with you." Clara understood what he was offering, not just help for her father, but a bridge for her. A way to maintain connection without surrendering the independence she'd fought so hard to claim. "That would be all right," she said softly. They left Thomas with promises to return the following week, and as they rode back toward town, Clara felt lighter than she had in years. The past couldn't be changed, but maybe, slowly, carefully, it could be healed. That night, Rowan took Clara to dinner at the hotel restaurant, the nicest place in Pine Hollow. He wore a suit that Clara suspected he'd bought just for this occasion, and he pulled out her chair and ordered wine and asked her about her dreams for the future like they were courting instead of already married. "I want to expand the cabin," Clara said, surprising herself with how easily the plans came. "Add a real kitchen, maybe another bedroom. I want to learn how to cure pelts and make things we can sell in town. I want to plant a garden come spring and see if anything grows at that altitude." "I want to teach you everything I know about the mountain," Rowan replied. "Want to show you the places I've never shown anyone. The meadow where elk come in summer, the hot spring hidden in the rocks, the peak where you can see 3 territories on a clear day. I want to learn to read those books on your shelves. I want to hear you laugh more often. I want to wake up next to you every morning." Rowan's hand found hers across the table. "I want that too. All of it." They stayed in Pine Hollow for 2 more weeks while Marshal Hendricks completed his investigation. During that time, something remarkable happened. Women started coming to Clara, quietly at first, then in growing numbers. They wanted to know how she'd found the courage to stand up to Crow. They wanted to know if what she'd done, choosing her own husband, learning to fight, refusing to be property, was something they could do too. Clara found herself holding informal gatherings in the boarding house parlor, sharing her story and listening to theirs. Stories of debts and abuse and men who thought women were commodities to be traded. Stories of dreams deferred and choices denied and anger that had nowhere to go. The law's changing, Clara told them. Slowly, too slowly, but it's changing. Crow's arrest proves that even powerful men can be held accountable. Your voices matter. Your choices matter. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. She watched something shift in their faces. Hope replacing resignation, anger replacing fear. And she understood that what had happened on the mountain was bigger than just her and Rowan. It was a crack in the foundation of a system that treated women as property, a crack that might, eventually, become a break. The trial date was set for late spring, after the mountain passes cleared. Clara and Rowan gave their depositions, signed their statements, and prepared to return home. On their last night in town, they attended a dinner at the church hosted by Reverend Morris, an apology of sorts for his role in the forced wedding. "I should have refused to perform the ceremony," the Reverend said quietly to Clara. "Should have found another way to help you. I convinced myself that marrying Blackwood was better than the alternative, but I should have fought harder to give you real choices." Clara thought about that for a moment, then shook her head. "If you'd refused, my father would have gone to another reverend, or just let Crow take me. What happened wasn't your fault, and honestly, She glanced at Rowan across the room, talking to Marcus Webb and smiling at something his friend had said. "I'm not sorry about how things turned out." The Reverend followed her gaze, and his expression softened. "I can see that. You've both changed each other. He's less isolated, more connected to the community. And you found strength you didn't know you had." "He showed me I had it," Clara corrected. "He just gave me the tools to use it." When they finally left Pine Hollow the next morning, half the town turned out to see them off. Mrs. Patterson pressed a package of supplies into Clara's hands. Mr. Chen gave them a beautiful tea set as a wedding gift. Sarah Dennison, who'd whispered about Clara at the wedding, hugged her and whispered an apology. "You're braver than I'll ever be," Sarah said. "You haven't had to be brave yet," Clara replied. "But when the time comes, you will be. I believe that." The ride back up the mountain felt different this time. Clara wasn't being taken somewhere against her will. She was going home. And when the cabin came into view, solid and safe and waiting, she felt a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwood," Rowan said softly. They spent the next week settling back into mountain life, but with new patterns emerging. Rowan taught Clara to track deer and read weather signs and identify which plants were edible and which would kill you. Clara taught Rowan that it was okay to laugh, okay to talk about Rebecca without drowning in guilt, okay to let someone else share the burden of survival. They worked side by side, expanding the cabin, adding the kitchen Clara wanted, and a workshop for Rowan's leatherwork. They argued about where to put the garden and how many chickens was too many chickens, and whether the new bed should go against the north wall or the east wall. They were small arguments, domestic arguments, the kind that married couples had when the biggest danger they faced was disagreeing about furniture placement instead of armed men in the snow. Spring came slowly to the mountain, revealing itself in patches of green among the white, and birdsong returning to the forest, and the creek running full and fast with snowmelt. Clara planted her garden, potatoes and carrots and herbs that might survive the short growing season. Rowan built her a greenhouse from salvaged windows and hope. On a warm afternoon in April, they rode down to the ranch to help Thomas with the spring repairs. Her father looked better, clearer-eyed, steadier-handed, like he was slowly remembering how to be human again. He and Rowan worked on fixing the barn roof, while Clara helped repair the fence posts, and if the conversation was stilted and careful, at least it was happening. "He's getting better," Rowan observed on the ride home. "He is," Clara agreed. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive him, but I'm starting to think I might not need to. Maybe accepting that he's trying is enough." May brought word that Crow's trial had been scheduled for June. Clara and Rowan rode back down to Pine Hollow to testify, and Clara stood in front of a packed courtroom and told the truth about everything Crow had done and tried to do. Other women testified too, former housemaids, widows he'd swindled, a girl from Copper Ridge who'd barely escaped a similar fate to Clara's. The jury deliberated for less than an hour, guilty on all counts. When the judge sentenced Harlan Crow to life in the territorial prison, Clara felt the final weight lift from her shoulders. The monster was caged. The nightmare was over. She was free in a way she'd never been before, free not just from Crow's threat, but from the fear that had shaped her whole life. That night, she and Rowan stood on the porch of their cabin and watched the stars come out over the mountains. The air was warm, filled with the scent of pine and growing things. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. "I've been thinking," Rowan said quietly, "about what you said before, about choice." Clara turned to him, curious. "What about it?" "You chose me when you had to, when it was either me or Crow. You chose me again when you could have surrendered. You chose me when we fought together." He took her hands in his gray eyes serious in the starlight. "But you've never had the chance to choose me when you had real freedom, when there was no danger, no coercion, no fear driving the decision." Clara's heart started beating faster. "Rowan, what are you saying?" He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small diamond. "I'm saying I want to marry you again. Properly this time. With you in a dress you chose. In a ceremony you planned. With vows we write ourselves instead of words a reverend recites. I want you to walk down an aisle toward me, not because your father's dragging you, but because you want to be there." His voice shook slightly. "I want you to have the wedding you deserved the first time, the choice you deserved." Tears were streaming down Clara's face, but she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "You want to marry me again?" "I want to marry you for real this time, the way it should have been from the start." Rowan dropped to one knee on their porch, and Clara realized he was trembling. "Clara Blackwood, will you marry me? Not because you have to, not because I'm the lesser evil, but because you want to spend your life with me?" Clara pulled him to his feet and kissed him hard, tasting salt and joy and the future they were building together. When she pulled back, she was laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes," she said, "yes, I'll marry you, again, properly, with flowers and a dress I chose and vows that mean something because we both have the freedom to walk away." Rowan slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Of course it did. He'd probably been measuring her finger in her sleep for weeks, planning this, wanting to give her the one thing no one had ever given her before, a real choice made in freedom instead of fear. They married again in August, in a meadow high on the mountain where wildflowers bloomed in impossible colors, and the sky stretched forever in all directions. Reverend Morris performed the ceremony, but this time the words were ones Clara and Rowan had written themselves. Promises about partnership and respect and choosing each other every day, not just once at an altar, but in 1,000 small moments that made up a life. Marcus Webb served as best man. Sarah Dennison stood up as Clara's witness, having become a true friend during the spring. Thomas Hayes sat in the front row and wept quietly, and Clara found she could smile at him without bitterness now. The whole town came, but this time they came to celebrate instead of judge. They came to witness a wedding built on love instead of debt, on choice instead of coercion, on two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful anyway. When Rowan kissed his bride, his wife, his partner, his choice, the gathered crowd erupted in cheers, and Clara Hayes Blackwood, who'd been sold at auction and learned to shoot her way to freedom, who'd been afraid and became brave, who'd been helpless and became strong, kissed him back with her whole heart. That night, they hosted a celebration at the cabin. Food and music and dancing under strings of lanterns Rowan had hung from the trees. Clara danced with her husband, with Marcus, with her father, with the women who'd come to her for advice and found their own courage. She danced until her feet ached, and her face hurt from smiling, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. When the guests finally left and the mountain grew quiet again, Clara and Rowan sat on their porch and watched the sun rise over the peaks they'd defended together. The light turned the snow on the distant mountains pink and gold, painting the world in colors that spoke of new beginnings. "Happy?" Rowan asked, pulling her close against his side. Clara thought about the girl who'd stood at an altar in a borrowed dress, terrified of the future and certain she had no choices left. She thought about everything that had happened since, the fear and the fighting, the shooting lessons, and the stand against Crow, the slow building of trust and respect, and something deeper than either. She thought about this man who'd saved her and taught her to save herself, who'd given her weapons and freedom and love without conditions. She thought about the life they were building together, high on a mountain where the air was thin but clean, where danger was honest instead of hidden behind polite words, where she could be strong and soft and everything in between. Happy, she confirmed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning mist. The mountains stirred to life around them, birds calling, deer moving through the forest, the wind carrying the scent of pine and possibility. And on the porch of a cabin that had been a prison and became a home, two people sat together and watched the day begin, knowing that whatever challenges came next, they would face them the way they'd faced everything else. Together, by choice, in freedom. The town of Pine Hollow would always tell the story of Clara Hayes, the girl who was sold to settle her father's debts. They'd tell about the dangerous mountain cowboy who married her, about the gunfight in the snow, about the woman who learned to shoot and fought for her right to choose, but they would never truly understand the truth of it. How a forced marriage became a sanctuary, how fear became courage, how two broken people found each other and built something whole. They would never know about the quiet mornings making coffee together, or the evenings reading aloud from Rowan's books, or the way Clara had learned to track a deer and Rowan had learned to laugh again. They would never know about the fights over garden placement, and the reconciliations that followed, about the scars they both carried and the gentle way they helped each other heal. They would never understand that what began as survival became partnership, and partnership became love, and love became the foundation for a life neither of them had dared to imagine. But Clara and Rowan knew, and that was enough. Years later, when other women came to Clara asking how she'd found the courage to fight, she would tell them the truth. That courage wasn't the absence of fear. That freedom wasn't given, it was claimed. That strength came from knowing what you were willing to fight for and finding someone willing to stand beside you while you did. She would tell them about a cabin on a mountain and a man who gave her weapons instead of chains. She would tell them that sometimes the worst thing that ever happened to you could become the doorway to the best thing, if you were brave enough to walk through it. And she would tell them that they had choices, always choices, even when it seemed like the world had narrowed to a single terrible option, that they were stronger than they knew, that they deserved respect and freedom and love that didn't come with conditions. Some listened and found their own courage. Some weren't ready yet. But Clara planted the seeds anyway, the same way Rowan had planted them in her, by showing that a different life was possible, that women didn't have to accept what men decided for them, that even in the darkest circumstances there was always a choice. The mountain seasons turned. Winter came and went and came again. The garden grew. The cabin expanded. Clara and Rowan built a life that was quiet and hard and beautiful, filled with the kind of peace that only comes after surviving something that should have destroyed you. And on cold winter nights, when the snow piled high and the wind howled around the cabin's walls, they would sit by the fire and remember the day they met. Not the wedding in the church. That was just where it started. But the moment in the cabin when Rowan had given Clara a choice and she'd chosen to take it, the moment when two strangers began the dangerous work of becoming partners, that was where their real story began. Not with vows spoken under duress, but with respect given freely. Not with a transaction, but with trust earned and returned. And that story, the one only they knew, the one made of quiet mornings and shared laughter and choosing each other every day, that was the story that mattered. That was the story they'd spend the rest of their lives writing together, one choice at a time.